14, how is the argument vulnerable to criticism? What's the flaw with this argument? So the argument says, unlike stars, planets don't generate light, but only reflect light. So we have stars generate light, and then planets reflect light. And then it says, besides stars, there are many other celestial objects in the galaxy that are not planets. So in other words, there's this third category of things that are neither stars nor planets. Hence, conclusion, therefore, there must be celestial objects in the galaxy that generate light but are not stars. Really? Says who? How do we know that these other objects generate light, right? We do know that there are these other celestial objects that are not stars or planets, and we know that stars generate light and planets reflect light. And then we said, therefore, this third category, these other celestial objects that are neither stars nor planets, they must generate light. How do you know that? Maybe they don't generate light. Maybe they're like planets, right? Why are we just assuming that planets are the only things that don't generate light? Why can't this third category of things also not generate light, right? We have no evidence, right? Just because support doesn't mean conclusion. It's hard to see how the support even would support this conclusion, but at any rate, the support is kind of saying that we have stars generate light, planets don't generate light, and we have this third category of things that are neither stars nor planets, and we say, therefore, this third category of things, these other celestial objects, must generate light. They must be like the stars. How do you know that? Maybe they're like the planets. Maybe they don't generate light, right? So we want to look for something that points that out in the answer choices. The way the question is worded is that the argument is flawed because, what does it say? Because the argument fails to consider the possibility that. So we need to look for one of these 5 possibilities that would ruin the argument, that would say, hey, maybe there's these other things that don't generate light, right? The conclusion says there must be celestial objects in the galaxy that generate light but are not stars. And we have to say, no, maybe there's things other than stars that are like planets that don't generate light, right? That's the possibility we want to look for. We want to suggest that, no, there are other things that do not generate light other than planets, right? That's what we want to point out. So let's look for that in the answer choices. So A, would this possibility ruin the argument if there were no celestial objects that reflected light other than planets? No, because if anything, that would sort of help the argument, because we're trying to say that what if there were no other objects that generate light, right? In this argument, generating and reflecting are kind of the two opposite sides of the coin. You have planets that only reflect light versus stars which generate light. And we're assuming that these third category of objects, these celestial objects in the galaxy that are neither stars nor planets, this argument is randomly assuming that they must generate light. We're trying to say, what if they don't generate light? In other words, what if they're like the planets? What if they just reflect light? So A is saying, what if the galaxy has no objects that reflect light other than planets? Whereas we're kind of trying to say, no, what if there are these other objects that do reflect light as opposed to generating light? So A is kind of backwards. It's not the possibility that would ruin the argument. It's kind of consistent with the argument, because if A were true, if planets were the only things that reflect light, well, that would give rise to the possibility that maybe everything else generates light, which is in line with what this argument is saying. So A is definitely not the right answer. B says, what if the celestial objects in our galaxy only comprise a tiny percentage of all the celestial objects in the entire universe? That's neither here nor there, because this argument is only about the galaxy, right? We're talking about stars and planets in the galaxy, and we talk about these other celestial objects in the galaxy, and the conclusion is about celestial objects in the galaxy. So B is saying, well, yeah, okay, but even if all that's true, what if that's not representative of the universe as a whole? To which we would respond, or to which the person making this argument would respond, okay, fine, who cares? Meaning that has nothing to do with what I'm arguing. I'm arguing about this galaxy. So if B is true, that the universe is not represented by this galaxy, okay, that's another argument for another day, but we're not trying to generalize to the universe, right? If we were trying to generalize from this galaxy to the entire universe, then it would be appropriate to say, well, how do you know that the galaxy is representative of the entire universe, which is what B is saying. But we're not trying to generalize to the entire universe. The whole argument is only about the galaxy, which is why B does not make sense. C says the argument is flawed because what if celestial objects in this galaxy are not the only celestial objects that are going to generate light? In other words, what if there are celestial objects outside of the galaxy that also generate light? Well, if there were, that wouldn't affect the argument, because the argument's only about celestial objects in this galaxy. So C is kind of like B. It's kind of hinting at, well, what about celestial objects that are not in this galaxy? What if they're just in other galaxies? What if they also generate light or don't generate light? Okay, but that wouldn't affect this argument, because this argument is only about celestial objects in this galaxy. Therefore, C is definitely wrong. D says the argument's flawed because what if there are a lot of other features that distinguish stars from planets other than this ability to generate light? Well, if there were other features that distinguish stars from planets, that would have nothing to do with this argument, because this argument is only about celestial objects generating light versus not generating light. D is saying, well, maybe there's other differences between stars and planets also. Maybe stars are very big and planets are very small. I don't know. But even if that were the case, if there were 100 other differences between stars and planets, okay, fine. It's not necessarily the job of this argument to point out every single difference between stars and planets. This argument is only trying to make a point about celestial objects generating light, right? So even if D were true, even if there were a bunch of other features that distinguish stars from planets, that's neither here nor there. That doesn't affect the conclusion about whether there are celestial objects in the galaxy that generate light or not. So therefore, D is not relevant. It's certainly not the flaw of the argument. E says the argument's flawed because what if planets are not the only celestial objects that don't generate light? In other words, what if there are other things that are not planets that also don't generate light? Yeah, that would ruin this argument, because the argument's saying we have stars that generate light and then we have planets that don't generate light. And we're assuming that this third category of things, these other celestial objects that are neither stars nor planets, we're assuming that they do generate light because they're not planets. We're assuming planets are the only things that don't generate light. E says, what if planets are not the only things that don't generate light? What if there are other things that don't generate light also, that are not planets or stars, right? They wouldn't be stars either, because stars we know do generate light. Planets don't. E says, what if there's other celestial objects that also, just like planets, that also don't generate light? That would ruin this conclusion, right? Because the conclusion says there must be celestial objects in the galaxy that generate light but are not stars. E says, how do you know that? Maybe there are other celestial objects that don't generate light, right? Maybe these other objects, like, why are you just assuming that planets are the only things that don't generate light? And then you're saying, well, there's these other celestial objects, they must generate light. E says, how do you know that? E says, maybe planets are not the only things that don't generate light. Maybe these other things also don't generate light. So it's kind of a double negative. It's a little tricky because it says planets are not the only things that don't generate light. But if you think about what that means that is to say, well, what if there are other things that also don't generate light, which would ruin this argument? So therefore, E is exactly the flaw we are looking for. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.